Okay, so today we're going to Aleppo. You know, Syria, the
Yeah.
city that's been at the heart of the Syrian conflict. And we're looking at a BBC article that goes inside Aleppo after the fall of Bashar al-Assad. So it's like a city trying to find its feet after this long, brutal war.
Yeah, and Aleppo was really important in the rebellion against Assad. It was one of the first major cities to fall to rebel forces, but it came at a huge cost. Years of fighting just left it in ruins, physically, but also like in terms of the social fabric there.
And that's something that the BBC piece really highlights. It's not just the physical rebuilding, but also the psychological scars, the fear, the uncertainty that lingers even when the dictator is gone. One thing that really struck me was the description of how the city's landscape has changed. Like all those pictures of Assad, the giant posters, the statues, they're all gone now.
Yeah, that's not just cosmetic. It's a real rejection of the old regime, like reclaiming that public space. And it makes me think about how dictatorships use these symbols to project power, to make themselves omnipresent. Do you think democracies do anything similar? I mean, are there symbols that if you remove them would cause the same reaction?
That's a good question. We have monuments and memorials, but they're more for general ideals, not individuals. Maybe the closest thing would be, I don't know, burning an American flag. That seems to evoke really strong emotions on both sides. But it's not the same as, like, toppling a statue of a dictator, is it?
Yeah, it's really about personalizing that power, like how authoritarian regimes try to fuse the image of the leader with the state. And removing those symbols is like breaking that fusion and saying the state is not the man.
And the article goes into this with a personal story. This family, the Ali family, Mahmoud Ali, his wife, and kids, they had to flee Aleppo back in 2012, and they ended up spending years in Idlib, which was basically trading one war zone for another.
It was the last major rebel stronghold. And even though it wasn't under Assad, it was still super dangerous and unstable.
Right, and now they've gone back to Aleppo, to this tiny flat. And you can hear the relief in their voices, but there's also this fear that's still there. The daughter, Samar, she says something that just breaks my heart. She says, "We're happy, but there's still fear. Why isn't our happiness full?" It's because of the fear the regime planted inside us.
God, that's just it right there.
Yeah.
That's the impact of living under that kind of oppression, never knowing who to trust, always watching what you say, even in your own home. That trauma doesn't just go away.
And they're kids. They only ever knew Assad's Syria. That must be so strange for them.
Think about it, their version of normal. Constant surveillance, no freedom, afraid to speak out. That was their reality. Now they're experiencing something totally different. It's got to be both exhilarating and terrifying.
Yeah, it makes you wonder how you even begin to heal from that. How do you rebuild that trust? How do you make a space where people feel safe to express themselves, to participate in their own government? It's a huge challenge.
It is, and lots of societies have faced it. There's no easy answer. It takes a combination of things. Truth and reconciliation, accountability for past abuses, but most importantly, a real commitment from the new leadership to uphold human rights and democratic principles. But even then, it's a long, hard process.
And in Aleppo, it's even more complicated. Because the group that led the offensive against Assad, HTS, they're basically in charge now. The article talks about this too.
Right, HTS is complicated. They're Islamists with ties to al-Qaeda, so there's baggage there.
Yeah.
On one hand, they were key in toppling Assad, but on the other, their ideology, well, let's just say it doesn't exactly line up with liberal democracy.
You say complicated. Some might say it's straight up dangerous. Isn't this just swapping one form of oppression for another? Didn't they also use violence and intimidation to get what they wanted?
That's a good point. And it's what a lot of Syrians are dealing with right now. It's like, okay, we got rid of Assad, but what did we replace him with? There's a lot of uncertainty, a lot of fear, like maybe the revolution just traded one authoritarian regime for another.
It's like that feeling of stepping out of the frying pan and into the fire. Even with Assad gone, there's still so much to be afraid of.
Absolutely. And it's important to remember that HTS isn't one single thing. There are different factions within the group. Some are more committed to their ideology than others, how those factions work with each other, and how they govern Aleppo. That's going to determine the city's future.
And the article doesn't sugarcoat the economic situation either. It sounds like poverty is everywhere, and even basic stuff is hard to come by.
Yeah, the economic damage from the war is insane. You've got entire neighborhoods just gone. Rubble, infrastructure wrecked, millions of people displaced. Rebuilding that is going to take a massive global effort. And frankly, who knows if there's even the will or the money to do it.
So even if you forget about the politics and the fear, there's this whole other problem of just surviving. People trying to feed their families, find a place to live, get health care. It's like a humanitarian crisis on top of everything else.
And that's really important. It's easy to get lost in the big ideas, revolution, regime change, all that. But we can't forget the human cost. For the people in Aleppo, it's not about freedom and democracy in the abstract. It's about putting food on the table and having a roof over your head.
And the kids too, right? The article mentions the Ali family's kids. They grew up knowing nothing but conflict and fear. What kind of future is there for them in a place like that?
That's what keeps me up at night, honestly. These kids have seen things no one should ever see. Their childhoods were stolen. And now their future is just uncertainty and hardship. There's a whole generation that's been traumatized. And the effects of that, who knows how far they'll reach.
There's this quote from a guy in the main square. He says, "I really hope we get it right, and there isn't a return to violence and oppression." It's simple, but it's just so full of longing, like he's desperate for some peace and stability.
Yeah, it really captures that feeling of just being worn down. Like so many Syrians are just exhausted. They've been through so much, years of violence and upheaval. Now they just want to rebuild their lives, have a better future for their kids.
It's almost heartbreaking the way he says it. I hope we get it right this time. Like they're carrying the weight of history, this fear that the violence is just going to start all over again.
And that's the tragedy. Even in victory, even when the dictator falls, there's still this doubt. Like the fight for freedom is never really over.
This whole deep dive has been a roller coaster. We went from Assad being gone to this sobering reality of what's next. The fear, the uncertainty, the wrecked economy, HDS. It's a lot.
It is. And it shows how complicated these situations are. There's no easy answer. No good guys and bad guys. It's messy, chaotic, and we can't oversimplify it.
So where do we go from here? What do we take away from Aleppo after Assad? What does it mean for Syria, for the world?
I think the biggest takeaway is that getting rid of a dictator, as great as that is just the first step. It's the start of a much longer and harder process. It's a long road to recovery, to putting things back together.
It's like we focus on the big moments, the Berlin Wall falling, Saddam's statue coming down, but then we forget about the long, hard work that comes after, healing, rebuilding trust, making a new system that actually works for people.
Exactly, and that work takes patience, persistence, and a willingness to get into the messy stuff. It means admitting we don't always have the answers, and listening to the people who are actually living through it, helping them build the future they want, not what we think they should have.
It's about empowering them, not controlling them, giving support without strings attached, not trying to make things turn out the way we want.
Exactly. And realizing that peace and stability can't come from the outside. It has come from inside, from the people who are invested in their own future.
So what does all this mean for us? Sitting here listening to the story about a city far away, why should we care about what's happening in Aleppo?
Well, just on a human level, we have to remember these are real people with real lives, trying to figure out a world that's been turned upside down. Their stories matter. Their struggles matter.
It's about empathy, right? Seeing our shared humanity, even when there are these huge differences between us.
Exactly. And understanding that the world is connected. What happens in Aleppo affects things everywhere. These conflicts cause refugees. They fuel extremism. They destabilize whole regions.
And eventually those things affect us too, whether it's refugees, terrorism, or the economy.
So it's not just about being altruistic. It's about self-interest too. We're all affected by what happens in these places, whether we like it or not.
You know, one thing that stuck with me from the article was the description of the Ali family's apartment. It's tiny, cramped, but it's home. They came back to it after years of being away, and they're trying to make it feel normal again.
It's powerful, isn't it? That human resilience. Wanting normalcy even in the middle of chaos.
Yeah, it shows that even in the worst times, people still want those simple things. A roof, a meal with their family, a sense of belonging.
And it reminds us that those things aren't guaranteed. They can be taken away so easily. By war, by famine, by politics. We have to appreciate them, fight for them, and support those who are trying to get them back.
I think that's a great note to end this part of our deep dive on. It's a story that's full of pain, loss, uncertainty, but it's also a story of resilience, hope, and the human spirit enduring. I feel like we've just scratched the surface here. This one article, this glimpse into Aleppo, it's just a snapshot. What about all the other stories out there? The people who didn't go back, or the ones who are still too scared to talk?
That's what makes it so interesting, right? It's not just about the facts and figures. It's about those human stories. the ones that get lost in the big picture of war and revolution.
Yeah, and thinking about those stories, it makes me wonder, what will Aleppo even look like in the future? I mean, with HTS in charge, with all the poverty, with all that trauma, is there even a way to have real peace and actually come together again?
That's the big question. And honestly, nobody knows for sure. But I think what we can do is look at other places that have gone through similar stuff. Rwanda after the genocide, for example, or South Africa after apartheid. They had to deal with the same things. How do you rebuild trust? How do you deal with all that violence? How do you make a society that's fair for everyone?
Those are some pretty heavy examples. But I see what you mean. We can learn from what they went through, see what worked and what didn't. Maybe there's a roadmap, not a perfect one, but a place to start.
Exactly. And I think one thing we can learn from those places is that reconciliation isn't a one-time thing. It takes time. It takes talking to each other. It takes being willing to face the past, to really see the pain that was caused. And it often means compromises, hard truths, and a lot of forgiveness.
It makes me think about that quote from Samara Lee again, the daughter who went back to Aleppo. She said, "Why isn't our happiness full? It's because of the fear they planted inside us." I don't know how you even start to deal with that.
It's really tough, both for people and for a whole society. But there are things that can help, like therapy that focuses on trauma, or programs in the community to help people come together. And art can be powerful too. It gives people a safe way to express their pain, their anger, their hope.
I like that. Art as a way to heal. And speaking of bridges, let's go back to HTS for a second. You said before that they're not all the same, that there are different groups within HTS with different levels of, let's say, extremism. What does that mean for Aleppo? Is there a chance that a more moderate group could take over and lead the city in a more democratic direction?
It could happen, and it's something to keep an eye on. Things are always changing within HTS. And there are definitely people in the group who are more practical, more focused on governing and keeping things stable, than on strictly following their ideology.
So it's not a sure thing that Aleppo will become an Islamist state.
Not at all. There's a lot going on here, and it's more complicated than simple labels like that. A lot depends on how HTS handles the economy, how they treat the people who live there, and how they deal with the rest of the world.
So there's a chance things could go well or badly. It's like they're at a crossroads. And which way they go depends on a bunch of stuff. Some of it they can't even control.
And that's how it is with these situations. They're hard to predict, and they don't fit neatly into categories. That's why it's so important to stay informed, to keep learning, and to listen to different points of view.
I feel like I've learned a ton from this deep dive, even though I have more questions now than when we started. And that's okay, right? It's better to be curious than to just accept things the way they are.
Totally agree. That's what I love about these conversations. It's not about finding all the answers. It's about looking at how complicated things are, seeing all the different sides, and in the end, understanding the world better.
So to wrap things up, I want to leave our listeners with this. The story of Aleppo is still being written. It's a story of loss, of resilience, of uncertainty, and of hope. And it's a story that we all have a part in, whether we know it or not. So stay curious, stay engaged, and stay tuned.
Yeah. Couldn't have said it better myself. And who knows, maybe we'll come back to this someday and see how things turned out.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time for another journey into the heart of the matter.